So yesterday we started with this simple model of consumer choice, from which we derived the demand curve. And we showed that the law of diminishing marginal utility, which we took as an assumption, that has the implication that the law of demand will be true, meaning the demand curve will be downward sloping. And then before moving on, we want to develop two measures which are going to be very relevant in our analysis. The first measure is the measure of consumers' welfare, right? How much do consumers gain from participating in this market and making their rational choices in this market? So that is captured by the notion of consumer surplus, which we discussed yesterday, both mathematically and in diagrammatic terms. The second measure, which I'm going to talk about today, is called the elasticity of demand. Again, if you've taken undergraduate economics, you're familiar with this concept, but let's sort of review and brush it nevertheless, but very quickly. For many purposes, one of the central questions is, if a good becomes more expensive, how do consumers react to that price change? And as long as the law of demand is true, which is true in our somewhat restrictive framework, we know the qualitative nature of that response, right? We know that consumers will cut back on the consumption of this good if it becomes more expensive. But for many purposes, it is not enough to know in which direction consumers will move, but also how much, right? So if the price increases 10%, then, will consumers reduce the demand by 5% or 20% or 50%, right? So that magnitude of cutback is very, very important. Now, that is where the concept of elasticity comes in, okay? The slope of the demand curve, to some extent, captures the magnitude of the response, right? That how much do they cut back? But the problem with the slope of the demand curve is that it is unit dependent. So if I measure, if rice becomes more expensive, how much less rice do people consume? I'll get one number if I measure rice in kgs, another if I measure it in grams, and another if I measure it in tons, okay? So the number itself is not that eloquent. I'll have to worry about the unit with which I'm measuring it. What the measure of elasticity does is that it gives us a unit-free measure of consumer response to price changes and changes in other factors. So let's give the definition. Okay, before that, let me talk about aggregation. Individual demand functions, consumer I's demand function is what we talked about yesterday, right? So each individual consumer has a demand function, which is downward sloping. The market demand function is easy to define. It's just the sum of individual demands. So that's the first line here. And since each individual demand function is downward sloping, the market demand function will obviously be also downward sloping. Now, what is the definition of price elasticity of demand? That's the last line here. Now, you can think of it as dq. An alternative way of writing this ratio is dq by q in the numerator and dp by p in the denominator, okay? So that means the ratio we have over here is a ratio of the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, percentage or fractional. Okay, so for example, when is the value of elasticity 1? That's when the demand response is exactly proportional. So prices rise by 10%, consumers reduce the demand by exactly 10%, no more and no less, okay? And since the changes are represented in proportional terms, that makes this measure unit free, right? It does not matter whether we are measuring quantity in grams or kilograms. We'll get the same number when we are calculating elasticity. Okay. For price elasticity of demand, or own price elasticity of demand, right? So this is a measure of quantity response when the price of the good itself changes. Okay, so that's there are different conventions. So we'll follow the convention. We'll put a minus sign in front. That's because this ratio is typically negative if the law of demand is valid, and so putting a minus sign makes the whole thing positive. So whatever number we calculate for specific markets and demand functions will always come out positive. Okay, so whether the price elasticity is high or low, there are two questions, right? One is, what does that signify? And the second is, what are its implications? And for what kind of goods can we expect high price elasticity, and what kind of goods low price elasticity? Intuitively, it seems quite obvious that for something like apples, a particular fruit, we can expect a high value of elasticity. Why is that? If apples become very expensive, and keep in mind that when we are defining this elasticity at the background, we are holding every other factor fixed, meaning the prices of other goods are held as fixed, the incomes of consumers is held as fixed, and so on. Okay, so if everything else remains the same and apples become more expensive, there are plenty of fairly good alternatives, substitutes to apples, right? There are other fruits, pears, banana, and so on, and grapes. And we might expect most consumers to switch to those other fruits as apple prices start to rise. So that's one thing, right? Are there close substitutes available? If they are, then elasticity will be very high. And for something for which there's no close substitutes, and which also is difficult to cut down on or avoid, for example, petrol, right? I mean, there are substitutes, electric cars, etc., but it's hard to switch to them very quickly, at the very least. And so if petrol prices rise, we don't expect demand to be that responsive. I mean, it will be cut back a little. People will try to, for example, carpool or use public transport maybe, but the scope for substitution or cutting back is relatively small. So price elasticity of something like petrol is going to be low, right? So low value of elasticity means that consumers don't respond too much to price changes, right? The demand doesn't change that much, whereas a high value of price elasticity means that consumers are extremely price sensitive for that good, that they very quickly switch to other goods or avoid buying this good. So it's a very useful measure, and it's a very useful measure for various purposes. For firms, for example, if they're considering raising prices, one of the trade-offs they face is that if they raise their prices, of course, they're earning more per unit of sale, but for every item they sell, but they'll be selling fewer items. So one question is, when they raise prices, what happens to their revenues? And that has an intimate connection to price elasticity. And I won't spell it out exactly right now, but you can easily see that when elasticity is greater than 1, revenues will fall if prices rise, and vice versa, right? Similarly, for the government, if the government is considering taxes on certain products, the effect of the taxes on tax collection has a lot to do with what price elasticity is in the market. Now, there are other measures of elasticity, right? In general, although right now we are studying a very rudimentary model and we are focusing on the price of the good itself, in general, demand functions are functions of not only the good's own price, so the quantity demanded for a good will be a function of the good's own price, and a vector of prices of other goods, then incomes, and so on. Okay, so this definition of elasticity can, of course, be extended to the other factors that are affecting demand. For example, the price of some other good, that is called cross price elasticity, or the income of the consumer, that will be called income elasticity. And all you have to do is, in the definition, just substitute the relevant factor. So for example, the income elasticity of demand is defined as exactly this formula, except that instead of the price of the good, P, you substitute by Y, the income, right? And you get a measure of income elasticity. Anyway, all of these measures give us how sensitive consumers are to changes in prices, changes in incomes, and so on and so forth. Okay, so as we go along, we'll see for certain kinds of questions how the elasticity measure plays an important role. At this point, I'm just defining it. What does income elasticity greater than zero mean? It means that these are goods which people buy more when they become richer, right? So they're called normal goods. That's the definition we apply. Whereas goods which have negative income elasticity, that means that people buy less of those goods when they become richer. Now, that might lead you to raise your eyebrow for a second or two. If I'm richer, why would I buy less of something? Well, we can think of examples like, for example, public transport, right? Whether I take the metro. I win the lottery and then I stop taking the metro because I bought a fancy car and I've hired a driver. So I'm not taking the metro anymore. So my demand for metro rides has fallen. So that's an example where income elasticity is negative. So those goods are called inferior goods, okay, for understandable reasons. Okay, so now let's move on to studying the firms, right? In goods and services markets, they are the source of supply. Although in income markets, input markets, the roles reverse, right? Firms are the source of demand for inputs like labor, capital, land, and so on, whereas households are the source of supply. So it depends on the market. Anyway, sticking to goods markets, the firm is the source of supply. And let's build a rudimentary model of a firm. Okay. And the starting assumption is going to be firms are, for every economic actor, as I said with that, empty row metaphor, if you remember in the very first lecture, the starting question has to be, what is their motive? What are they up to? What is their objective that they're trying to fulfill? So in classical price theory, the standard assumption is that firms want to maximize their profits. That's what they are there for, right? Now, of course, there are exceptions. We have public sector enterprises, we have non-profits, and so on. But in a capitalist free market system, most firms will be profit-driven. So let's sort of start with that assumption at the very least. Okay, so let's say in this market we are studying, let's say the market for bread, there are M different firms. These are the bakeries who make the bread. And we'll index them by J going from 1 to M. And the firms, essentially profits are the difference between revenue and costs. So we have to pay some close attention to the cost side, right? How do costs change when the firm bakes and sells more bread? So that is captured in what is called the cost function. Okay, but before we get to that, let's think about different notions of costs. Okay, first of all, there's the idea of opportunity cost. All right. So suppose I right now I'm a professor at Delhi School, and suppose I have a bright idea that I want to start my own business. Okay, so I resign from my job and I start my business. And in my business, I invest some of my own savings. Now, to my accountant, the accountant at the end of the year, when he's calculating my profits and he's looking at my books, the accountant will look at costs like, labor costs, how much did I have to pay my employees, interest cost, if I took a loan, what was the interest on that loan, and so on. Yeah, rents, if I hired some office space, how much rent did I pay? Some of the things which the accountant will not take into account are nevertheless very important. So for example, if I have started the business by giving up my job, right, the salary which I was making, I'm making no more. So that should be counted as a cost. It is called opportunity cost, right? It's not an out-of-pocket expense, but it's something I've given up when I engaged in this activity of my own business. Similarly, if I've invested some of my own money, right, I don't have to pay interest to myself explicitly. So the accountant does not have an entry which shows that as a cost. But I could have put the money in the bank in a fixed deposit or a mutual fund, and that would have given me some returns. And I'm giving up those returns when I'm investing in my own business. So that again, the foregone wages, the foregone interest earnings on my own capital, those are what are called opportunity costs, right? So in our economic models and our economic analysis, when we write down things like costs and cost functions, it has to be understood that opportunity costs are included. Okay. Later on, we'll talk about the concept of zero profits. Okay. So sometimes when in a market free entry and exit are possible, I'll develop that notion later in a little while. But there will be this condition that entry takes place in a market till each firm is earning zero profits. When we say zero profits, we don't mean in the accounting sense, right? To the accountant, it may show positive profits, a margin between revenue and costs. Zero profits in economic analysis means zero economic profits, meaning revenue minus all the explicit costs as well as all the opportunity costs, like how much salary I've foregone, how much interest I've foregone, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let me be explicit about this then. Take the example that I'm starting my own business, right? And my monthly revenues are, let's say, rupees 5 lakhs. This is the revenue side. And on the cost side, I have to pay wages to my employees. That's 2 lakhs, right? I have to pay rent, which is, let's say, 1 lakh. And I have to pay interest on some bank loan I've taken when I started the business. Let's say that's 50,000, right? And let's say there's no other explicit cost here, okay? Now, that my accountant will look at these numbers. This will be the entire books. And the accountant will say, okay, your profit is 5 lakhs minus 350. So profit is, your total cost is 350 lakhs and your profit is 1.5 lakhs per month, okay? Now, as an economist, I will object to that. I will say, okay, there are other hidden costs or implicit costs. What are they? I'm sorry, this thing is misbehaving again. Foregone salary. I have to give up a job where I was making I had a wage. Foregone salary. And let's say that's about it, right? Let's say I haven't invested my own funds even. And let's say the foregone salary is whatever, 2 lakhs. Okay. So I'll say, okay, that's an opportunity cost. This cost, which comes from the fact that I've given up something. And the overall economic cost is the sum of the explicit out-of-pocket expenses as well as the opportunity cost. And so the overall economic cost is 5.5 lakhs. So my economic profit is actually minus 0.5 lakhs. Right, that is my economic profit, which is actually a loss. Okay, so all I'm saying is that in these little models, when we write down a cost function, you have to understand that the cost includes both explicit as well as implicit or opportunity costs. And when we talk about something like whether a firm is making profit or loss, it is profit calculated in this more inclusive sense. It incorporates opportunity costs in addition to explicit costs. Okay, so that's one thing. All right. Now, coming to another aspect, So let's take another example, right? So there's a lawyer, let's say, who has his own law practice, okay, has a chamber, a law, an office somewhere, has hired some legal clerks, secretaries, fellow lawyers to work for his law firm, and so on. And the lawyer thinks that, oh, I'm unhappy, this being in the courtroom making arguments. I want to be a Bollywood star. So I go to Bombay, Mumbai, and try my luck, right? So maybe I'll earn more, or I have better prospects or whatever. Now, let's review what the lawyer is in his current law practice, what kind of costs are involved, okay? So one kind of cost is that, to become a lawyer, you have to go to law school, and there were fees, there were, hostel charges, there were all kinds of expenses. Also, if the law school took 4 or 5 years, there were foregone earnings. When you're undergoing education, you give up some income. So these costs, so if he wraps up his practice, he's not going to get back these costs. Right? His law school is not going to return his fees saying, oh, sorry, you are not in law practice anymore. Here's a 50% refund. Costs, which will never come back. They're irreversible. No matter going forward, what the decision of the firm is, including any decision to shut down the business altogether, right? So in the lawyer's case, all the costs incurred in the past in legal education, etc., will be an example of a sunk cost. Now, there's another kind of cost, which is fixed cost, right? So the lawyer is renting office space, okay? Now, that office space, the rent on the office space has to be paid no matter how many clients he's serving per month, right? Even if that's a trickle, there's very few clients coming in, he has to pay the same rent, right? So that's a kind of cost which is independent of how much he's selling, how much of his services he's selling. It's independent of volume. But that cost will go away if he shuts down his business altogether, right? And terminates the rental contract and doesn't renew it and so on. So that's a fixed cost. Fixed cost is an avoidable cost, but it is independent of the quantity of the good or service that the firm is selling. And finally, there's variable cost. So for example, if he's serving more clients, maybe he has to hire more office staff or more lawyers to handle all the cases, and the wages paid to them will increase if he's trying to serve more clients. So that's what is called variable cost, yes, where the cost is dependent or is a function of the total volume produced and sold. So this distinction is important for some purposes. So there's no sort of rule written in stone that college fees are sunk costs. It depends on the time at which we are looking at that item, right? If the fees haven't been incurred yet and law school hasn't been chosen yet, then it is not a sunk cost, of course. Then it is very much a cost when he's evaluating whether he should go to law school and pursue a legal career. But after he has finished his degree, it has become a sunk cost. 3 or more options, the opportunity cost of any one alternative is the best that you could earn from all the other alternatives. Let's take your example. Even if you shut down your business, your rental contract still has 4 months to go, so there's no way you can avoid that. So as far as the next 4 months is concerned, right, your decision-making horizon is the next 4 months, and you're thinking whether to shut down or not. For that time period, for that time length, this rent is not really a fixed cost in the sense that I'm talking about. You can, you can think of it as a sunk cost. It's an unavoidable cost. But if you're thinking of a longer time horizon, that 1 year from now, should you stay in this business or not, there it becomes a fixed cost and an avoidable cost. There's a few typos here. I'll spell it out. I'll correct it in the notes. So for firm J, fixed cost is, let's say, FJ. This should be J subscript. And the variable cost will, of course, have to be captured by a function, right? A variable cost, by definition, is a function of output. So let's say phi j is that variable cost function. Typical assumption, first derivative strictly positive, second derivative also strictly positive. First derivative captures marginal cost. Okay, if the firm increases its output by an infinitesimal amount, as a ratio, how much does cost go up, right? That's the derivative. So that's marginal cost. And the second derivative captures the rate at which marginal cost is changing. So positive second derivative means we have increasing marginal cost. Okay. So the total cost function, forgetting sunk costs because they're irrelevant anyway, the total cost is this fixed cost, Fj, and this. And you can also think of an average cost function, which is, of course, total cost divided by the total quantity xj. So this phi j term here, that's another typo. It should be divided by xj. So the average cost function takes that form. Now, if you look at the first component, the fixed cost divided by the quantity, that is, of course, a declining function. It's really a rectangular hyperbola. So that is a declining function. So one component of average cost goes down as the firm's production increases. Now, the second component may be increasing, especially if you have increasing marginal costs like this. Okay, so there's two forces pulling in opposite directions on average cost as the firm increases its production. So often we take the average cost function to be U-shaped, right? And that's a natural shape that often comes out because of these two opposing forces, right? Not always, it's not absolutely necessary, but it usually takes that form. Okay, so the firm is doing this profit maximization. So as usual, first derivative has to be 0, and second derivative needs to be negative for some quantity to be a true profit maximizing amount. So if you take the first derivative, set it equal to 0, you get this condition C prime, which will be phi prime, right? Because this is a constant, the fixed cost part. So slope of the total cost function is the same as the slope of the variable cost function. So marginal cost equals price. So just as for the consumer, we got the condition optimizing principle, price equals marginal utility. For the firm, we have the optimizing principle, at least as long as the firm's optimum is some interior point, right? It's not 0, it's not some infinity. If it's a finite, strictly positive amount, then it has to satisfy this condition, price equals marginal cost. And again, the intuition is pretty obvious, and you should be this should be bread and butter to any economist. These marginal conditions, right? If marginal cost was less than price at some quantity, then if the firm increases its production, that extra production costs less than what it fetches on the market. And so that extra production is profitable. It adds to the firm's profit. On the other hand, if the firm is sitting on a production level where marginal cost is greater than price, then obviously the last few units which the firm has produced was not profitable. So if the firm cuts back production, then that'll increase their profits. So the optimum is where these two things are equal. Now, the second order condition also needs to be satisfied, which means the second derivative of this function has to be negative. Now, the second derivative is basically the negative of the second derivative of the cost function. Okay, and since we have assumed that there's increasing marginal cost, that automatically takes care of our second order condition. That guarantees that the second order condition will be satisfied. Let's come to the issue of, just as with the demand curve, the supply curve of a firm will have, can we say something about its slope, right? And the answer is yes. We can basically easily prove under these kinds of assumptions, especially increasing marginal cost assumption, that the supply curve of the firm will be positively sloped. Okay, so let's quickly prove that. Just the same trick as we did in the consumer's case. Take the first order condition, price equals marginal cost. Inside the marginal cost function, insert the supply function. The supply function is basically defined as that quantity which makes this equality true. Okay, so by definition, the supply function, when you insert it into marginal cost, its equality with price is true by definition, so it's an identity, which means we can equate the derivative of the two sides. So if we do that by chain rule, on the left-hand side, we get C double prime, second derivative of the cost function, times xj prime, which is the slope of the supply function. That equals derivative of the right-hand side, which is 1. Okay, and then by transposition, you can express the slope of the supply function as the reciprocal of the second derivative of the cost function. And since we assume the second derivative to be positive, that immediately tells us that the supply curve has a positive slope, which means since each individual firm's supply curve has a positive slope, that means the market supply curve, which is the sum of the individual supply curves, that also has a positive slope. So we have a nice, at least a qualitative characterization of demand and supply, which is that demand curve in the market will be downward sloping and the supply curve will be positively sloped. Now, what you see here, again, you see it in a very simple form, but let me draw your attention to it at the cost of repeating myself. Assumptions like diminishing marginal utility or increasing marginal cost, they play two important roles at the very least. One is that you saw that they help us satisfy the second order condition. We don't have to worry about it, right? So some of the starting assumptions about slopes of certain functions play that role, that they help satisfy the second order condition. But they also give signs to what may be called comparative statics exercises, right? What happens when price changes? That is basically saying the consumer's optimal choice changes when the price changes, right? So the assumption about utility functions, cost functions helps us put a sign on our demand and supply functions. So they give some content to what are called comparative static exercises like that.
Sir, in the last slide, you have mentioned an assumption about the budget constraint of firm. Could you explain what is this thing?
What is this thing?
Budget constraint as long as they are profitable. So I don't get this condition. How is it important here in this firm's maximization problem?
Okay, so I was going to come to this point later. It's a very important point. I was going to come to it when we have a full-blown discussion about the theory of the firm. But since you raised the point, let me quickly mention it without going into too much detail. Although we don't usually spell it out, right? What are we saying here? We are saying that, okay, the firm takes the price as given. It has a cost structure, a cost function. And then it solves this exercise. What quantity should I produce that will lead to the maximum possible profit? Now, to produce that quantity, often the firm has to pay the costs up front and earn the revenues only later, right? If you're buying raw materials, for example, you have to buy them, make the good, and then sell it, right? So if the firm doesn't have some balances, some cash reserves, the firm has to find a way of financing, and that could come through borrowing debt. That could come through equity. It sells IPOs and raises money that way. There has to be some mode of financing. Now, when we write down the first order condition like this, implicitly, aren't we assuming that the firm will get the financing that it needs? Now, that is an assumption. In the real world, that is not always satisfied. So I just wanted to throw in that caveat, and I'm glad you noticed it. But yes, we are making that in the simplest classical theory of the firm. We are assuming that there's no funding bottleneck. If there's a profit opportunity, the financial markets, credit markets, equity markets will somehow provide the funding that the firm needs to realize that profit opportunity. That's an implicit assumption here, right? We'll review that assumption more later.
Thank you, sir. Actually, this is never mentioned in undergraduate textbooks, so this was new.
Glad there's a little bit of value added to what I'm saying. Okay, excellent.
I just secondly, I just wanted to ask, is this assumption realistic? When we talk about firms in general, do they have increasing marginal costs?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Right? There's a couple of things to say here. Okay, when you're building any kind of scientific theory, you take a gamble. You make an assumption. The assumption may or may not be true. Okay. Now, many economic theories are very contingent. They're contextual. They hold in some contexts and not in others. So, for example, we have studied the model of perfect competition. Right? Is that realistic? Well, yes, in some situations. If you're thinking of the grain market in India, huge market, lots of farmers, lots of buyers. Well, it's not a bad model to use. Is it true of the telecom market at this point, where we have essentially 2.5 sellers? No, the telecom market has basically become oligopolistic, and people are worried that it may even become a monopoly or a quasi-monopoly. So we have a model of perfect competition which applies to the rice and wheat market, and we have a model of oligopoly, which we'll study in the second microsequence, which applies to some other markets, right? So in economics, unlike the law of gravitation, inverse square law of Newton is supposed to be universal. It applies in the solar system, in our Milky Way galaxy, in Alpha Centauri, everywhere, or Einstein's laws, whatever. In economics, most of the laws are often models are often contextual. They have limited terms of reference. So the question often is that, is it relevant to enough situations, and are we applying the right model for whatever we are studying? Yes. So similarly, your specific question was, is it realistic that there's increasing marginal cost? There are lots of production processes where it is realistic, but not everywhere. Things like railways, for example, or electricity provision, they are marked by, and that's, I think, what's sort of in your mind when you're asking this question on the previous one, that there are so-called economies of scale, which I'll elaborate on later, and those markets will not fit this analysis, but plenty of other markets will. So same kind of ideas will apply also to the supply side. So we can talk about elasticity of supply, especially with respect to the price of the good itself. So that's a definition. Same way, right? And we can also talk about how much is the firm getting out of this transaction and the opportunity to participate in this market. And that is essentially the profits. But there's another fancy name, which is, producer's surplus, to kind of show some sort of correspondence with the consumer surplus concept. Producer surplus is nothing but profit, right? But one way to write it is exactly the same way that we depicted consumer surplus, either in pictures or in the math. This upward sloping curve is interchangeably the marginal cost curve of the firm and the supply curve of the firm, just as marginal utility curves served as the demand curve. For the same reason, because of the optimizing principle, the marginal cost curve also serves as the supply curve. Now, keeping that in mind, if there's a market price P, for example, like this, what is the profit of the firm? Well, we know that the optimum quantity is given by this Q naught, right, where the price line intersects the marginal cost. And the profit is the area under the price line and above the marginal cost, right? Essentially, the first unit, loosely speaking, that the firm produces, loosely speaking because this is a continuum, but nevertheless, if you think of it as a small number of discrete units, the first unit which it produces has a huge gap between price and cost, right? Its cost is the marginal cost and the price is much higher. So that vertical distance is the profit earned on the first unit, which is makes and sells. Then the second unit produces somewhat lower profit because marginal cost is climbing, but nevertheless, there's a vertical distance which covers that. And this area is obtained by adding up all these vertical distances going from zero up to the optimal point of production. So that's why this area is really the profit or the producer's surplus. Okay. And then how does it all come together? So what is the core of the classical theory of price? It's captured in the concept of a market equilibrium. So the implicit idea is that the prices in a market, unless there's some restriction from outside, from the government side. If the market is given free play, then the price is like a thermostat or something, right? It adjusts. It adjusts to do what? It adjusts so that the market clears. What do we mean by market clearance? We mean demand, quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equated, they match. Okay. So formally speaking, in this single market that we are looking at, this is called partial equilibrium analysis. Here, the market equilibrium is characterized by the following. It's a price, a particular price. We'll call it P star. It's a Q star, which is a vector of quantities consumed by the various consumers, right? So this is a 1 by n vector. And X star is a vector of quantities produced by the firms, right? So a market equilibrium is just a vector of prices and quantities, right? Quantities, one for each participant, which has the property that at this price, the quantities are exactly the demands that consumers will make and the firms will supply. And this is the most critical thing, the total demand coming from consumers will be exactly equal to the total demand coming from firms. So this is the market clearance condition, that equilibrium takes place not at any arbitrary price, but at that price where demand and supply are equal. Okay. Now, this theory has empirical content, right? This theory says that there's a tendency in markets to eliminate any mismatch between demand and supply. That may or may not be true. Okay, there are other theories, more advanced theories. I mean, we'll see perhaps some of them in the second microsequence, which create in what is called endogenous price rigidity, that the price somehow gets stuck even if there's no legal regulation like a minimum wage law or a rent control, nothing of the sort. Even if left to itself for certain reasons, often having to do with asymmetric information, the price may get jammed. Even if the market is not clearing, the price gets stuck at a certain level and doesn't move up or move down beyond that. So we are not studying those theories, we're studying the classical theory, which says, well, prices will adjust, right? So everything is, you know, in theory, we proceed in steps. Okay, now, so that's the basic simple idea, okay? Now, let me mention a few issues related to this concept, but this is going to be the core concept which will apply. So one issue is existence, right? These are theoretical issues that, okay, given this definition, can we be sure that we can always find a price which will lead to market clearance, right? I mean, usually, yes. Then there's an issue of uniqueness, okay? Is there a single price? Because if theoretically there's more than one price that clears the market, then this particular theory is a little short in terms of making predictions, right? Which of these prices, which of these equilibria will come about? It has nothing to say on that. So uniqueness is something that we worry about. You know, under our assumptions in this simple, somewhat restrictive model, kind of existence and uniqueness will be guaranteed, right? It's simple enough and a single market. So here I'm being very informal, right? But I'm just trying to familiarize you with these issues. First of all, you know, you may not have, it looks like you may not have an intersection if your demand curve is like this, and your supply curve even starts at a lower point and goes downwards, right? But you know, I can define the supply curve as then grazing the axes, right? There's a highest price. Sorry, this is the demand curve and this is the supply curve. So it looks like there's no intersection and there's no market equilibrium. But I can define the supply curve as grazing the axis below this price, right? So to supply any positive amount, suppliers need at this minimum price. After that, they start supplying positive amounts. But below that price, their supply is still well defined. It's just zero. Whereas for the demand curve, to demand any positive quantity, consumers need, you know, has to The price has to be lower than a certain amount. But above that price, there's still demand is well defined. It's a zero. Okay. So if you have a picture like this, I can still, by extending the definition in sensible ways, I can say, okay, there's a market equilibrium. It's just that, equilibrium takes place in this price range and involves zero quantities. Okay. So existence can be easily guaranteed in this simple framework. And other than this case, whenever there's an interior equilibrium, it is unique, clearly, because we have downward sloping demand supply curves, so they have only one intersection. Later, when you study in the second part general equilibrium, where we study multiple markets, then these questions of existence and uniqueness are more non-trivial, right? And you need stronger assumptions to sort of guarantee these things. But you'll cover that when we get there. There are two other issues. One issue is stability, and well, before that, is the classical theory almost is based on some sort of fiction or parable. Okay, it does not tell us anything about the process through which the price comes about. All right, if you look at something like stock markets often have an explicit price formation process. There are so-called market makers. Sometimes it can even be a computer algorithm, which collects data from the two sides about buying and selling plans, demands and supplies, and then uses that information to explicitly find a price where there is a match between buying plans and selling plans, right? So those markets can easily be, this sort of model fits those markets quite well. But most markets don't have an explicit price formation procedure which is centralized in the market. So for example, if you go to your local vegetable market buying vegetables, there are many sellers and many buyers. Yes, but there's no sort of authority in the market who is announcing that this is the price of brinjals and this is the price of potatoes and so on. It somehow emerges from the organic interaction of many buyers and many sellers. So our hope, when we use this sort of simple model, is that somehow this very simplified model captures that complex process through which prices emerge, right? Now, economists have sort of tried to build more explicit models, for example, using auction theory and the system of double auctions. There's almost an auction, there's some bidding. So one seller announces a price, then another seller tries to match or undercut that price. There's some process which is explicitly more modeled. And one of the questions in those advanced theoretical treatments is whether a more complex process essentially boils down to this simple model, whether price through that complex process actually settles down to the level where demand supply will equal. Anyway, I'm just pointing various avenues which branch off from the main stem of price theory, in case anybody is wondering what the foundations are. And then there's a question of stability, right? If there's a certain process through which prices are supposed to reach the equilibrium level, is that process stable? So if you start with a price which is not market clearing and there's an adjustment process, does the adjustment process go away from market clearing prices, or does it converge towards it? That's another question, which again you will come across in general equilibrium.